Today, we're tackling something that I think a lot of people struggle with, and that is disagreeing politely in a business setting.
Yeah, especially for those of us who use English as a second language at work, right?
Exactly. It can be so tricky to navigate those situations.
You want to get your point across, but you also want to make sure that you're not damaging those important relationships.
Right. And honestly, sounding natural while you're doing it, that's the real key. Well, we have just the thing to help us out today. We're going to be diving into a blog post from businessenglishtalks.blogger.com. It's called How to Politely Disagree in Business Meetings. And it's full of great advice and phrases that you can use in everyday business situations.
It's a fantastic resource for anyone who wants to improve their business communication skills in English.
So if you're a B1 English speaker and you're looking to level up your communication game, we'll be speaking nice and slow today so you can follow along and really absorb everything.
We want to make sure that this deep dive is valuable for everyone, no matter what level you're at.
So why don't we jump right into it? The blog post starts off by talking about, well, it's called Why Polite Disagreement Matters. It might seem kind of obvious, but they make a really good point about how disagreeing well can actually boost your career.
Oh, absolutely. I've seen it firsthand. When you can voice your opinion respectful, even when it's different from the majority, that shows that you're a critical thinker and that you can handle complex situations with grace.
Right. It shows that you're not afraid to challenge the status quo, but you're doing it in a way that's constructive and professional.
It's about being assertive, but not aggressive.
Exactly. Have you got any particular examples of this in action?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I remember this one colleague, let's call her Sarah. She used to be a bit too agreeable, kind of a people pleaser, and it was really holding her back.
I can see how that would be a problem. If you're always saying yes to everything, you never really get to share your own ideas or contribute in a meaningful way.
Exactly. But then Sarah started consciously practicing these polite disagreement techniques. And it was amazing to see the transformation.
Oh, really?
People started taking her more seriously. They saw that she had valuable insights to offer. And she ended up leading some pretty major projects because people trusted her judgment.
That's incredible. It really shows how this seemingly small skill can have a huge impact on your career.
It's not just about avoiding conflict. It's about building a reputation as someone who's thoughtful and confident and capable of handling tough conversations.
Like a secret weapon for career success.
I like that.
All right. So how does the blog suggest that we approach this? What are some of the key strategies that they highlight?
Well, one of the most fundamental strategies is acknowledging the other person's point of view before presenting your own. Sounds simple, right?
Yeah, it does.
But you'd be surprised how often people forget to do this.
Oh, I know. We get so caught up in our own arguments that we forget to really listen and acknowledge the other person's perspective.
Exactly. And when you don't do that, it creates this instant feeling of defensiveness. And the conversation can quickly go downhill from there.
Instead of having a productive discussion, you end up with two people just talking past each other.
Right. So even a simple phrase like, I understand where you're coming from, but can make a world of difference.
Yeah, it shows that you're not just dismissing their idea outright. You've actually considered it carefully.
Right. It sets a more collaborative tone from the start.
I like that. So what else does the blog recommend?
Another key strategy is using neutral language. You know how sometimes in meetings people just throw out phrases like, "That's a terrible idea," or "You're completely wrong."
Oh yeah, I've definitely heard that before. It never ends well.
It's like a recipe for disaster. You're just creating tension and resentment. And it certainly doesn't help you get your own point across effectively.
Right. It just shuts down the conversation.
Exactly. So instead, the blog suggests using phrases like, "I have a slightly different perspective on this," or "I'm not sure I entirely agree."
Those phrases sound so much more diplomatic and professional.
They are. And for non-native speakers, this is where the real subtleties of the language come into play. Because you might not even realize that certain phrases are considered rude or aggressive in a professional setting.
That's true. So having a resource like this blog post can be really valuable.
Absolutely. It breaks down those nuances and gives you alternative phrases that sound more natural and respectful.
Okay, so we've got acknowledging the other person's point of view and using neutral language. What else stood out to you from the blog post?
Well, they also talk about the power of asking clarifying questions.
Oh, I love asking questions in meetings. I feel like it helps me understand things better and, really get to the heart of the issue.
Me too. It's a great way to gather information and make sure that everyone's on the same page. But it's important to use questions carefully.
What do you mean?
Well, questions can be used in two very different ways. They can be used to genuinely seek understanding, or they can be used to subtly undermine someone's argument.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
It's all about the intention behind the question.
If you're asking questions to genuinely understand someone's perspective, that can lead to a more productive and collaborative discussion.
Exactly. But if you're using questions to pick apart their idea or expose flaws in their logic, then it can create a very different dynamic.
It becomes less about finding a solution and more about winning an argument.
Right. And that can be especially tricky when English isn't your native language. Because even if your intention is good, the way you phrase a question might come across as challenging or disrespectful.
That's a really good point.
So it's all about reading the room, so to speak, paying attention to the tone of the conversation, the body language of the other person, and choosing your words carefully.
Okay, so it's not just about what you say, but how you say it. Do you have an example of a question that could be perceived in different ways?
Sure. Imagine someone is presenting a proposal for a new marketing campaign, and they suggest focusing primarily on social media advertising. You could ask, do we have any data to support the effectiveness of social media ads for our target demographic? Right.
Now, depending on your tone and the context, that question could be interpreted in a few different ways.
It could be a genuine request for more information, like you're just trying to understand the rationale behind their strategy.
Exactly. Or it could be perceived as a challenge, like you're doubting the effectiveness of social media ads.
Oh, that's interesting. So it really does come down to those subtle cues. Your tone of voice, your body language, and even the specific wording you choose.
Exactly.
That's a valuable lesson for anyone working in English, whether it's your first language or not.
I think so too.
Okay, so we've covered some really valuable strategies so far. Acknowledging the other person's perspective, using neutral language, and asking clarifying questions thoughtfully. Anything else we should keep in mind before we move on?
Yeah, there are a couple more things from the blog post that I wanted to highlight. First, once you've respectfully disagreed with someone's idea, it's important to offer alternative solutions or suggestions.
Oh, that's a good one. It shows that you're not just being contrary. You're actually trying to find a better way forward. Right, you're being proactive and solution-oriented.
It shows leadership.
It does. And finally, the blog post emphasizes the importance of being mindful of your tone of voice. This is crucial because tone can completely change the meaning of your words.
Oh, I know. You could have the most perfectly crafted phrases, but if your tone is aggressive or sarcastic, it's going to undermine your message completely.
Exactly. And I think this is especially important for non-native English speakers because sometimes the nuances of tone can be really difficult to master in another language.
Yeah, that makes sense. Even if you're trying to be polite, your tone might unintentionally come across as rude or dismissive.
Right. So it's really about being self-aware and paying attention to how you sound.
Maybe even recording yourself speaking English and listening back to it.
That's a great idea. You can also ask for feedback from native speakers you trust.
Okay, so we've got acknowledging the other person's viewpoint, using neutral language, asking clarifying questions thoughtfully, proposing alternative solutions, and being mindful of our tone. What a toolkit for disagreeing politely in English.
It is quite a toolkit.
What do you think we should explore next?
You know, I think it would be really helpful to look at some of the specific phrases that the blog post suggests using so we can see how to put all of this into practice.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's dive into those phrases and see how they work in real-life situations.
Sounds good to me. I think this is where it gets really interesting for people listening, especially if English isn't your native language and you're using it in a professional setting.
Right, because we can talk about the strategies, but what about having the right phrases at your fingertips to use in the heat of the moment?
Exactly. It's one thing to know what to do, but it's another to actually be able to do it.
And to do it in a way that sounds natural and confident.
Totally. And this is what I love about this blog post. It gives you actual phrases you can use.
So let's hear some of those phrases. What do they suggest?
One that I use all the time is, I see your point, but I wonder if it's a really good way to acknowledge the other person's perspective while still introducing a slightly different viewpoint.
Yeah, it's not saying they're wrong. It's just opening up the conversation to other possibilities.
Right. And it works in so many situations.
Oh, I know. Like whether you're talking about marketing strategies or project timelines,
Right.
or even just deciding where to go for lunch.
Right. It can help steer the conversation in a more productive direction.
So it's a versatile phrase.
It is.
Do they have any other phrases for expressing disagreement?
Oh, yeah. Lots. Another one they suggest is, I understand where you're coming from, however.
Okay, that's a bit similar to the last one.
It is. But it puts a little more emphasis on the contrast between your viewpoint and theirs.
It's like you're saying, I respect your opinion, but here's another way to look at it.
Exactly. And that, however, creates this pause, this moment of reflection, before you introduce your own perspective.
That's clever. Those subtle nuances of language can really make a difference.
They really can. And you know this is especially important for non-native speakers, because sometimes the direct translations of phrases from your native language might sound too harsh in English.
Right. Like in some cultures, it might be perfectly normal to say, I disagree, or even, you're wrong. But in English, that can sound very blunt and disrespectful.
Yeah, especially in a professional setting.
Exactly.
That's why it's so important to have those softer, more diplomatic phrases, so you can express disagreement without causing offense.
It's like learning a whole new set of rules for communicating in English.
It is.
Are there any other phrases that you find particularly helpful?
This one is good when you're disagreeing with a suggestion. I appreciate the idea, but I'm not sure it's the best approach in this case.
That's good because it's polite, but it also makes your position very clear.
Right. And it opens up the conversation for further discussion.
Right. It's like you're inviting the other person to explain their reasoning.
Yeah. Or to consider other options.
So you're keeping the dialogue going.
Exactly. You're not shutting it down.
And it shows that you're working together as a team, not as like adversaries or whatever.
I like that.
So what about when you need to be a bit more assertive? Like when you really disagree with something?
In those cases, the blog post suggests using phrases like, I have a different perspective on this, and here's why. Or, while I respect your opinion, I believe that.
Okay, so those are a bit stronger.
They are. But they're still respectful.
Yeah, you're acknowledging the other person's viewpoint, but you're also making it very clear what you think.
Exactly.
And I like that. Here's why. It gives you a chance to really explain your reasoning.
Right. You can present your case and back it up with evidence.
And this is where having a good command of English vocabulary and grammar can really come in handy.
Oh, absolutely. Because if you're struggling to express yourself clearly, it can undermine your credibility.
Even if you have a great idea. It's like you need the language skills to back up your confidence.
Totally.
So we've talked about the strategies for disagreeing politely, and we've looked at some specific phrases. What do you think about looking at a real-world example?
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. It would be helpful to see how all of this comes together in practice.
Well, the blog post actually includes a scenario from a business meeting.
Perfect.
So let's take a look at that and see what we can learn from it.
Okay.
So the scenario is a team meeting. They're discussing marketing strategies for a new product launch.
Classic.
One person suggests focusing only on social media advertising.
Okay.
And another person thinks that email campaigns should also be part of the strategy.
Ah, the classic marketing debate.
Right. So how do you think the person who wants to include email campaigns should approach this disagreement?
Well, based on what we've discussed so far, I think the first step would be to acknowledge the other person's suggestion and the potential benefits of social media advertising.
Yeah, make sure they feel heard.
Exactly.
And then
Then they can express their own viewpoint and explain why they think email marketing is important.
Okay, let's see what the person in this scenario actually does.
Okay, so they start by saying something like, I see the value in focusing on social media, especially for reaching a younger audience.
Okay, so they're acknowledging the other person's idea.
Yeah,
And
then they say, however, I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of email marketing for building long-term customer relationships.
Nice. They're using that, however, to transition to their own perspective.
Exactly.
And they're highlighting the benefits of email marketing.
Right. They're not just saying, I disagree. They're providing a reason why.
And what happens next?
Well, to wrap up their point, they propose a compromise. They say something like, perhaps we could allocate a portion of our budget to email marketing while keeping social media as our primary focus.
Oh, I love that. It's a win-win situation.
It is. It allows them to test out their idea. without completely derailing the other person's plan.
And it shows that they're approaching the disagreement from a collaborative perspective.
Right, which is so important in a team environment.
I think that's a perfect example. It really shows how you can disagree politely and still get your point across.
Right, and it's a good reminder that disagreement doesn't have to be a negative thing.
Yeah, I agree. When it's done well, it can actually lead to better solutions.
And stronger relationships.
Exactly. So for our listeners out there who are working in English as a second language, what are some key takeaways from today's deep dive?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that polite disagreement is a skill. And like any skill, it takes practice.
So don't be afraid to try out these phrases and see what works for you.
Right, find your own style. And don't worry about making mistakes.
Everybody makes mistakes, even native speakers.
It's all part of the learning process.
So be patient with yourself and just keep practicing.
And I think another important takeaway is to be aware of the subtle cues in communication, like your tone of voice, your body language, the words you choose. All of these things can affect how your message is received.
It's like learning a whole new cultural code.
It is, in a way.
But the good news is that you can learn it by immersing yourself in the language, watching movies, listening to podcasts, talking to native speakers.
The more you expose yourself to English, the better you'll become at understanding those nuances.
Right. And remember, the blog post we talked about today is just one resource. There are so many others out there.
Oh yeah, tons.
You can join conversation groups, find a language exchange partner, take a business English course.
There's no shortage in options.
So take advantage of them and keep learning and growing.
It's an investment in yourself.
And it will pay off in the long run.
Okay, before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a little something to think about.
Right?
Think about a time when you had to disagree with someone at work.
How
How did it go? What did you learn from that experience?
It's always good to reflect on your past experiences
You can learn a lot from both your successes and your failures.
and use those lessons to improve your communication skills.
Okay, so that's it for today's deep dive. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you learned some valuable tips for disagreeing politely in English.
If you want to learn even more, be sure to check out the full blog post at businessenglishtalks.blogger.com.
There you'll find lots of helpful phrases and examples.
And until next time, keep practicing and keep those conversations flowing.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.